The early sun bathed Ouagadougou in a golden hue as President Ibrahim Traoré exited the presidential palace. Unlike the usual mornings packed with formal meetings and state affairs, this Monday held a different atmosphere. The young leader of Burkina Faso had made a decision that would catch his security team off guard, and alter the paths of many. "Take me to the central prison," he instructed his driver calmly, adjusting the collar of his plain brown shirt. "No prior notice. No media. Just us." The driver glanced back, eyes wide in the mirror. "Sir, should we at least inform the prison staff? Arrange security?" "No," Traoré replied firmly. "I want to see the real conditions our citizens face behind bars, not a rehearsed display." The black presidential vehicle rolled through Ouagadougou's busy roads, trailed only by two discreet, unmarked escorts. Street vendors shouted out their goods, children played in dusty alleyways, and life pulsed on, unaware that their president was headed somewhere few dared to visit. About 40 minutes later, the convoy halted before the towering gray facade of the Ouagadougou Central Prison. Barbed wire glinted menacingly along the concrete walls, and the atmosphere felt thick with untold stories. The guards froze when they saw the vehicle's insignia. "Mr. President," one guard stuttered, fumbling with the gate's heavy keys. We weren't expecting you." "That's exactly why I've come," Traoré said, stepping out. "Open the gates." Warden Pascal Wedrao rushed over, sweat gathering on his brow despite the morning's cool air. "Your Excellency," he said nervously, "had we known, we would have made arrangements, the facilities, the inmates." "I'm not here for stage tours," the president cut him off, walking straight past. "Take me to the prisoners." The warden hesitated, then obeyed, leading him down a narrow corridor where distant coughs, low murmurs, and the metallic echo of slamming doors filled the air. A pungent stench hit them, the smell of unwashed bodies, moisture, and hopelessness. As they stepped into the main cell block, an eerie silence settled. Moments earlier, hundreds of inmates had been passing time, playing cards, lying on thin mats, staring at stained walls. Now one by one they rose. Their expressions flickered between shock, confusion, and something long buried, hope. President Traoré moved among them, not with condescension but with sincere interest. He shook hands. He asked questions. He listened, really listened. Even his guards looked surprised at his attentiveness. "How long have you been here?" he asked one man. He turned to a man in his 40s. "How long have you been in here?" the president asked. 3 years, Mr. President." "What were you accused of?" "Theft, sir." "Do you have any family?" "Yes, a wife and 2 kids, sir. They come to see me when they can afford the bus fare." The president gave a thoughtful nod and continued on, mentally recording every exchange. Some inmates spoke openly about their situations. Others stayed quiet, guarded. A few broke down in tears, shaken by the unexpected presence of their nation's leader. For more than an hour, Traoré walked the crowded cell blocks, sat on cold concrete floors, and shared moments of raw humanity with men long neglected by society. But it was a shadowy, dimly lit cell at the very end of the hallway that pulled his attention. Inside, a man sat alone in the corner. He hadn't moved when the others stood. His head hung low, hands loosely folded in his lap. A scruffy beard framed his tired face. His clothes were thin and worn. Everything about him, his posture, his silence, spoke of someone who had accepted defeat. Unlike the other prisoners who rushed to witness the president's arrival, this man stayed completely still, as if life had stopped surprising him a long time ago. President Traoré approached slowly, stopping just outside the cell. The man lifted his gaze, slowly. Their eyes met. There was no shock, no fear. Only a deep, aching sorrow and exhaustion that ran soul deep. Something about this man was different. He didn't have the hardened edge of a lifelong criminal. His expression reflected not anger, but the quiet suffering of someone who had lost everything. "What's your name?" the president asked softly. "Emmanuel," the man murmured, barely audible. "How long have you been here, Emmanuel?" 7 years, sir." The number hung in the air like a stone, heavy, silent. 7 years. President Traoré studied the man's face. There was no trace of bitterness, no rage. Just quiet dignity, a man who had survived injustice without allowing it to turn him cruel. "What were you accused of?" Traoré asked. Emmanuel's throat tightened before he answered. "They said I stole money from the company I worked for. But I swear, sir, I didn't. I was with that employer for years. When things went wrong, he needed someone to blame. And I was easy to throw away." As Emmanuel spoke, his voice slowly grew stronger. Like a long-closed door inside him had creaked open, The presence of someone actually listening stirred something long buried. The president remained silent, listening closely, his years of experience allowing him to read what wasn't being said just as clearly as what was. Their conversation went on, but Traoré already knew. This meeting, this moment, would mark a turning point in both of their lives. In this dim corner of an overcrowded prison, justice was awakening, through the most unlikely voice. The silence inside Emmanuel's cell was deep, interrupted only by the distant clangs and echoes of prison life continuing beyond the bars. President Traoré stood firm, eyes locked on Emmanuel as he continued. "I had no lawyer," Emmanuel said, his tone steadier now. "No one to speak for me. When I was brought to court, I stood there alone, while my old boss sat beside a row of expensive lawyers." He paused, the memory clearly sharp. "The judge barely looked at me and then said it. 15 years. A cold fury stirred in the president's chest. "Tell me about your employer," he said. "His name was Laurent Guerre," Emmanuel replied. "He ran a logistics company. I worked there as a clerk for 8 years. I was always on time, worked hard, never took a day off." He paused, eyes clouded. But then, his nephew needed a job. The sentence trailed into silence. Even after all these years, the sting of betrayal was sharp. President Traoré turned toward the warden, who had been hovering nervously nearby. "Bring me this man's file," he ordered. "Every document. Every scrap of evidence. Every record from his trial." "Sir, it may take some time to find." "You have until sunset," Traoré cut in sharply. "And I want the names of the arresting officers, the judge, and a full breakdown of the investigation." The warden quickly nodded and rushed off. The president turned back to Emmanuel. "Why didn't you file an appeal? Surely there were legal options." Emmanuel let out a bitter laugh, not angry, just hollow. "With what money, sir? My wife left me in the first year. Took our children and went back to her parents' village. She said she couldn't carry the shame." His voice grew steadier as he continued. "I had no money for appeals. No friends in high places. And no one who cared enough to hear my side." President Traoré listened, his expression tightening. This wasn't just the story of one man's suffering. It was the indictment of a system that had utterly collapsed, one that crushed the poor while shielding the powerful. "Has anyone visited you in 7 years?" he asked. Emmanuel shook his head. "No one," he said quietly. "I wrote letters during the first 2 years. None of them were answered. Eventually I gave up. I found peace in silence." That evening, President Traoré sat alone in his office at the Ministry of Justice, a thick file spread open across his desk. What he read made his blood run cold. Emmanuel's case wasn't just a mistake, it was a disaster. The investigation had been rushed, the evidence flimsy, and the trial had lasted less than 2 hours. Worst of all was the discovery about the judge. Justice Amadou Diabra, who had sentenced Emmanuel, had been dismissed from the bench 3 years earlier, for taking bribes. The man who condemned Emmanuel to 15 years in prison was himself a criminal. The president grabbed the phone and called his Minister of Justice. "Dufresne, I need you here. Right now. Cancel whatever you're doing." Minister Dufresne arrived within the hour, finding President Traoré pacing like a lion behind his desk. "You said it was urgent, sir?" "I visited the central prison today," Traoré said without pause. "I met a man named Emmanuel. He's been locked away for 7 years for a crime he likely didn't commit." He handed over the file. "Read it. All of it. Then explain how our system could fail this completely." As Dufresne flipped through the pages, his face turned pale. The case was indefensible, built on false evidence, pushed through by a corrupt judge and ignored by a justice system that never gave the man a chance. "Sir, this is horrific," the minister said quietly. "But the conviction, it still stands. We can't what?" the president snapped. "Can't pursue justice? Can't undo our own failures? Can't admit we locked up an innocent man for 7 years?" The minister fell silent, realizing there was no arguing with him. "This is what we're going to do," Traoré continued. "Tomorrow you will gather an independent review board. I want prosecutors, defense lawyers, and human rights observers. They will reinvestigate every detail of this case." He paused, eyes hard. "And I want Laurent Guerre investigated. If he did this to Emmanuel, he's done it to others." Over the next 48 hours, the special team worked without rest. Their findings were damning. Guerre's company had made similar allegations against 5 other employees in the past 10 years. In every instance, the accused were poor, had no legal defense, and were convicted quickly. A clear pattern had emerged. Even worse, Key pieces of evidence in Emmanuel's case were discovered to be fake. A handwriting expert confirmed his supposed confession was forged. Financial records were altered. Everything pointed to a carefully staged frame-up. When the team delivered their final report, President Traoré felt both vindicated and enraged. Emmanuel had been framed. His life stolen by a rich man's lies and a broken system's silence. "We won't just set him free," the president declared. "We will deliver justice. And we will make sure this never happens to another soul in this country." The next morning, President Traoré returned to the prison, this time with news cameras and a legal team in tow. The nation was about to witness something historic. The presidential convoy pulled up at Ouagadougou Central Prison. As the sun rose higher, reporters, officials, and cameramen followed the president through the halls. Their footsteps echoed with anticipation. Word had already spread. Something extraordinary was unfolding. In his cell, Emmanuel sat unaware of the chaos outside. 7 years of silence had taught him not to expect miracles. When he heard the approaching footsteps, he barely lifted his head, assuming it was another routine check or perhaps a new cellmate. "Emmanuel," a familiar voice called. He slowly looked up and froze. It was President Traoré. But he wasn't alone. A team of legal officials stood behind him. News cameras were recording. The hallway buzzed with quiet awe. His heart pounded, but disbelief held him back. "Emmanuel," the president said, his voice cutting through the silence of the prison block, "I've read your file. You weren't just wrongly accused, you were betrayed by a system that should have protected you." Gasps echoed as prisoners leaned against their bars, witnessing history in real time. "I'm sorry," Traoré continued, his voice heavy with emotion. "Our country failed you. Our courts failed you. But today we begin to set that right." He turned toward the legal team standing beside him. "Emmanuel," he said, voice steady, "you're going home today." For a moment the words didn't register. "Home?" Emmanuel echoed, dazed. After 7 long years, the idea felt as distant and surreal as flight. His knees buckled slightly and he grabbed onto the cold bars for balance. This is real?" he asked, voice cracking as tears welled up and spilled down his cheeks. "It's real," the president affirmed. "You're a free man now." The cell door creaked open, one final time. Emmanuel stepped into the hallway slowly, his legs trembling beneath him. A wave of cheers erupted from the other inmates, bouncing off the concrete walls in a roar of shared triumph. Some shouted, others clapped, and many wept, seeing in Emmanuel's release a rare glimpse of hope for themselves. Outside, a crowd had formed. Word of the president's unexpected intervention had swept through Ouagadougou, drawing citizens eager to witness this rare moment of justice. As Emmanuel stepped into the sunlight, blinking against its brightness after years under flickering bulbs, the crowd exploded in applause. Reporters surged forward, microphones outstretched. "How does it feel? What's next for you? Do you hold resentment toward those who put you here?" Emmanuel stood still, overwhelmed by the chaos, the questions, the cameras, the freedom itself. It was all too much. Too fast. Finally he found his voice, quiet but clear. I don't know how to feel," he admitted truthfully. "I have no family waiting. No place to live. No job to return to." He paused, looking toward the sky, then back at the faces around him. "But I have hope. And maybe that's enough to begin again." President Traoré gently placed a reassuring hand on Emmanuel's shoulder. "You are no longer alone," he said, his voice rising above the crowd. "This country owes you more than words can ever repay, but we will stand with you, and we will do everything we can to help you rebuild your life." True to his promise, President Traoré personally drove Emmanuel to the presidential guest house, where he would stay until proper arrangements could be made. For Emmanuel, the simple luxury of a hot shower, clean clothes, and a meal at a real table felt like stepping into an entirely different world. That evening, in the comfort of the guest house's sitting room, President Traoré sat across from Emmanuel, 2 cups of tea between them. The formal distance between president and citizen had dissolved, replaced by something deeper, 2 men sharing a moment of human connection. "Tell me about your dreams," Traoré asked. "Before all this happened, what did you want from life?" Emmanuel smiled for the first time in years, a genuine, unguarded expression. "I wanted to be a teacher. I studied education before I took the job with Goret. I loved the idea of helping children learn, of giving them the tools to build better lives." "Then that's what you'll do," the president said firmly. "We'll help you finish your education. When you're ready, you'll have a place in our school system." But Traoré had an even broader vision taking shape. As Emmanuel slowly adjusted to freedom in the following days, the president began working on something unprecedented: a national audit of the prison system. If this happened to Emmanuel, he told his cabinet, how many others are suffering similar injustices? How many innocent people are rotting in prison while we applaud ourselves for law and order? The cabinet meeting was tense. Several ministers expressed concern about what a full review might reveal. What if hundreds of wrongful convictions were uncovered? What if public confidence in the justice system crumbled? Then we fix it, Traoré replied. All of it. No matter how painful. No matter how embarrassing. No matter how costly. Justice delayed is justice denied, and we've denied it for too long. Within a week, President Traoré launched Operation Justice Light, a nationwide review of all prisoners who had served more than 5 years, with special attention to those who lacked legal representation. Emmanuel would not only benefit from this renewed pursuit of justice. He would become its symbol, and eventually one of its architects. The transformation had begun. Not only for Emmanuel, but for a nation finally ready to confront its own failures. 3 months after his release, Emmanuel stood before a packed auditorium at the University of Ouagadougou. Dressed in a crisp white shirt and dark jacket, he was nearly unrecognizable as the broken man who had walked out of prison. But the real transformation was in his voice, strong, clear, and purposeful. I speak to you today not as a victim, he began, his voice filling the silent room, but as a witness to what happens when power operates without accountability, and as proof of what's possible when leaders choose courage over convenience. In the front row, President Traoré listened with pride. This event had been Emmanuel's idea, to share his story with the future lawyers of Burkina Faso. It was part of a broader change that had already captured international attention. Operation Justice Light surpassed all expectations. In just 6 months, the review teams examined over 2,000 cases and found 347 people who had been wrongfully convicted or held beyond their sentences. Each story revealed broken families, lost years, and human dignity crushed by a system that had strayed from its purpose. One of the most disturbing findings was the pattern of corruption tied to Laurent Gueur and others like him. Investigators uncovered a network of wealthy businessmen who used false accusations to silence employees, rivals, or critics. Judges were bribed, evidence falsified, and witnesses intimidated. Gueur himself now sat in the same prison where Emmanuel had lost 7 years of his life, facing charges of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. The irony was not lost on Emmanuel, who visited his former employer to offer forgiveness. His words moved even the hardened businessman to tears. Justice is not revenge, Emmanuel told him through the prison bars. It's the hope that others won't suffer as we both have, you in your greed and me in my innocence. President Traoré, deeply moved by the encounter, appointed Emmanuel as special advisor on prison reform and human rights, a position created specifically for him, and one that quickly became essential. Emmanuel's work took him across Burkina Faso, from major urban prisons to remote jails that had operated without oversight for decades. In each place he carried not just his official authority, but the lived experience of wrongful imprisonment. In the northern town of Dori, he found a man forgotten in a cell for 12 years without trial. In Bobo de Lasso, he met 3 women imprisoned for so-called economic crimes, later revealed to be simple poverty. Each case strengthened Emmanuel's resolve. He realized reform could not stop at freeing the innocent. It had to include job training, psychological counseling, family reunification, and legal support systems. Freedom isn't just opening a cell door, he explained to international human rights observers. It's giving people the tools to rebuild, and making sure the system that failed them is rebuilt to serve justice, not power. President Traoré fully embraced that vision. Under his leadership, Burkina Faso became a beacon of judicial reform in West Africa. Legal aid clinics were established in every region. Mandatory training for judges and prosecutors was implemented. An independent prison oversight board was created, with Emmanuel as its chair. The changes came at political cost. Powerful figures tied to the old system fought back, accusing the president of being naive and Emmanuel of being vindictive. But the public stood firmly behind the reforms, especially as more families were reunited and more wrongs righted. 1 year after his release, Emmanuel returned to Ouagadougou Central Prison for a ceremony that would have once seemed unimaginable. The facility had been fully renovated, now offering humane conditions, educational programs, and legal aid services. At the entrance, a new plaque read, "Justice delayed is justice denied, never again." Before a crowd of officials, former inmates, and families, Emmanuel reflected on the journey. "A year ago I sat in a cell believing the world had forgotten me," he said. "I was wrong. The world hadn't forgotten. It simply wasn't listening. Today we celebrate not just my freedom, but our shared commitment to ensure that every voice is heard, every case judged fairly, and every person treated with the dignity they deserve." President Traoré took the podium next. He spoke only briefly. "Sometimes," he said, "a leader's greatest achievement is knowing when to follow. Emmanuel has taught our nation more about justice than any law book ever could. The work continues, but our foundation is strong." As the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, Emmanuel remained a moment longer in front of his former cell, now converted into a library. Sunlight streamed through the barred window, falling across shelves filled with books on law, human rights, and justice. Tools for future generations to build a fairer world. Walking away from the prison one final time, Emmanuel carried no bitterness for the years lost. Only hope, for the lives that would be saved by the changes he helped spark. Justice, he had learned, is not a destination. It is a journey, one that requires vigilance, courage, and a willingness to listen to voices too often ignored. As the sun set over Ouagadougou, painting the sky with brilliant hues of orange and purple, Burkina Faso continued on its journey toward a more just tomorrow.